welcome to Grand Rounds, and thanks very much to Rob and Meng for letting me hijack the session here. I'm very pleased to be up here. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Kate Kelly. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for Melbourne Health, and I'm really pleased to be standing up here today to introduce our Grand Rounds guest speaker. So Samuel Shem, who's the pen name of Dr. Stephen Bergman. He's a novelist, playwright, essayist and activist. He's a graduate of Harvard College and Medical School and Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. He was on the faculty at Harvard for 35 years. His novels The House of God, Fine and Mount Misery have sold over 3 million copies. I'd just be interested in a show of hands for who's read The House of God. Just to talk a little bit about some of the books. So The Spirit of the Place won 2 USA Best Novels of the Year awards, and his play, Bill W. and Dr. Bob, just completed a year-long run off Broadway. One of the things that Shem, as he likes to be called, was really pleased to tell us just before he came out to Australia was that about not that long ago, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, Publishers Weekly, which is a big sort of publishers, magazine for the publishers around the world, had a list of the 10 best satires of all time. And on that, House of God was number 2. And if you're asking the question that he asked, what was number 1? It was Don Quixote. So there you go. So this talk is titled Staying Human in Medicine, From the House of God to the Spirit of the Place. And with that, I'd like to welcome Samuel Shem. Thank you.
First of all, nobody's going to be tested on any of this, and there are seats in the front. So if you want to, as a speaker, now I've got a gap here that's even bigger than the gap, so we can't move this thing. So if you want to come down, there's plenty of seats here in the front. I want to make an announcement that Kate Kelly, most of you know of her, if you don't know her, she is resigning as of this lecture because I'm bringing her back to Boston to run my life. This woman's incredible. I mean, it's astonishing. If I'd had a woman like that, I would have accomplished something in my life. So I'm delighted to be here, absolutely delighted to be here. I must say, it's so, there are no coincidences, right now, I hope you're not listening to it. I saw somebody listening on their, whatever this screen is. There's the last, thank God, presidential debate in America. And I just think what's brought to mind is somebody saying, characterizing America, which is finally really true, as a country with 2 right wings. And what I've realized is this is my 3rd trip to Australia, and it's really been a remarkable trip. Brisbane and Sydney and here. And you guys have it right. You have it about right. No country gets it really right, but you have it pretty right. And America has stopped having it pretty right. And so I think, one of the additional laws I've put on to our writing of the book is learn your trade in the world. Learn your trade in the world, meaning you can't just sit here as doctors. You have to sit here thinking, what am I doing that has an effect in the world? And a very happy and moving couple of incidents happened just this morning. If you're not a practicing doctor, you can notice what goes on in hospitals and outside of hospitals. If you're in them, it's hard to notice, right? Sometimes, because you're so busy and all of that. But I'm staying at the hotel at the Children's Hospital there, and the building is like, what? 3 different kinds of cafes in a hospital? And it's got everything there. But, it's so touching. If you ever want to get inspired again, if you're burnt out, that's only probably 3/4 of this one. If you're burnt out and you want to be inspired, sit in the lobby of the Children's Hospital, and you will see, these kind of horrible cases, quote, horrible kids with really severe diseases, with at least the people who show up, dedicated parents and caretakers. is just so moving to, in that really beautiful place, to see such suffering and to see how it's being taken care of. And, you know, I realize that probably if you're on the front lines of serious pediatric hospitalization, it's a little harder. But just, you know, maybe just walk through that one day and sit down in, you know, the lobby with the beautiful stuff and just watch. And you will be inspired. That's why we do this, really. It's really remarkable. And then, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, I got here a little early and I was just sitting outside the hospital on the street and, you know, just watching things, right as I could watch them, you know. And this woman comes up, you know, comes out of the hospital, not to go, an older woman. This is the other end of the spectrum, you know, quite old woman, but spry and all of that. And she's dabbing her eyes. You know, she's just a tragedy in here, or a sadness. So get out, you know, one of the things that happened in the house of God that I'll talk to is that we got isolated in these big hierarchical systems where the pressure comes down, the lowest down. What happens to us with the interns is that we got isolated from each other, right? You can, if you remember in the book, Potts commits suicide and Eat My Dust, Eddie goes crazy, which is pretty true. But we stopped seeing each other. Now, we not only got isolated from each other, each of us got isolated from our authentic experience of the system itself, right? Which meant that we thought we were crazy for thinking this was crazy. And that's really a bad place to be. And the other thing that happened in those days, it's less so now when people have more time, the interns have more time because of the hours cap, is that the hospital isolated us from outside the hospital. We were always in the hospital. So marriages went on the rocks, and you know, the surgical department, half the surgeons get divorced in their training. Half. You know, and that's pretty regular. So, so getting out of the hospital and looking around is a really good thing to do. The talk title is, as I said, as Kate said, Staying Human in Medicine from the House of God to the Spirit of the Place, which is not quite my last novel so far, but it's one that is a kind of bookend to the House of God. The other thing that is quite remarkable about my trip this time around is when I was in Brisbane, you know, I just given a lecture and somebody comes running outside of the room after, oh, Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Like, what? This doesn't compute, you know. And I have to say, I was very moved by that. And I was moved by that because the journey that I'll talk about is the same journey. I mean, I'm not putting myself in a class of Dr. Lee by any means, but he's one of the few people older than me in the world now. He's sort of this little man with a mustache, you know. Now, he was in Las Vegas when he heard the news, which is interesting. But we were products of the 60s, right? I went to college from 62 to 66, and then to Oxford from 66 to 69. And so we grew up in a very strange and rare time in the United States, you know, between two eras of unregulated capitalism, which is what we have now, when there was a sort of social safety net that came all the way from FDR to Reagan. And what we learned in college was really, we thought this was the way the world was. We thought this was normal. We learned, because of all of the assassinations, violence, racial unrest, you know, all of it, which we haven't seen until now again, where the city's going up in flames. We realized that if we got together and took action, we could change things. What a bizarre idea, right? But we helped put the civil rights laws on the books, and we ended the Vietnam War. You know, so that was the mindset in all of this. And I just have to read one stanza from my favorite song of Dylan's. It was, I think, in a basement tape or something. It's not very well known. But he says, it's called Up to Me. You can look it up. It's a wonderful song. If I'd have paid attention to what others were thinking, the heart inside me would have died. but I was just too stubborn to ever be governed by enforced insanity. Someone's got to tell the tale. I guess it was up to me. And, you know, the reason that I write is, well, the Boston Globe asked me, why do you write? And I said, I didn't even realize I said it. It was the last question of the interview. This was recently. And then I read it in the paper. What you read in the paper is obviously true. And I said, I write because I write to draw attention to injustice, which we just talked about. And I write about the danger of isolation and the healing power of good connection. The danger of isolation and the healing power of good connection. That's what I'm going to talk about today, and I'll go through a few of the things that I've written to try to deal with it. The thing that gets me going as a writer, this is all, you know, nobody realizes what they're doing until much later, but this is what we were doing in the house of God. The thing that gets me going is something I call, hey, wait a second moments. And these are moments, maybe you even have them already today, but you're going to have them sometime during the day. And that's when maybe you walk past someone who's asking for some change, and you don't give it to him, and then you say, well, why didn't I give the guy? He looked okay. Or you do something and you regret it. And there are a lot of those. And looking back, you say, hey, wait a second. Why didn't I do that, or why did I do that? And in the house of God, the Beth Israel Hospital in Boston, enough of these, hey, wait a second moments happen that it's like this song. That's why I love it so much. Someone had to tell that tale. I guess it was up to me. I mean, that was the actual thing in my head. Somebody's got to write about this. And, you know, I had tried to be a writer before. I never written a novel, but I started in on it. Okay. So I started on the House of God. And it started just as a catharsis, really. You know, some of the guys who were still in the medical field would, you know, Chuck, Eat My Dust, Hyper Hooper, The Runt. They were all around Boston. I'd started my psychiatric training right away at a big mental hospital called McLean, which I wrote a sequel to called Mount Misery. I don't know if people know it. It's not as popular as the House of God, but it's the same character in his psychiatric training. So we start, you know, we'd get drunk and have a tape recorder running, and, you know, Chuck told his story about, which we didn't believe, but he insisted was true, that, you know, hey, want to be a doctor in, you know, at the House of God? Fill out and return this card, you know. And I was writing plays, but I wanted to get a play agent. So I asked somebody at McLean Hospital where I was working, you know, do you know any play agents? She said, yeah, I know this play agent in New York. So I wrote the play agent, and she wrote back and said, I don't do plays, but you mentioned down at the bottom in one line, you mentioned that you have part of a doctor novel that you wrote. So why don't you send that, what you have? So I didn't really want to do it, but you know, what I had was I didn't even know you were supposed to double space. Typewriter. Anybody in the room know a typewriter? It's a thing that now we have a big box with other things attached to it. It's a, you know, keyboard it is now, not a typewriter. It had, you know, I was drinking heavily in those days, you know. In fact, you can read The House of God. You read it, you can go back and read it, and it's drenched in alcohol. It floats in alcohol and some drugs. We can talk about that later. You know, all kinds of liquor stains and beer bottle stains and cigar ash and coffee. It was a total mess. I put it in an envelope, sent it off. Forgot about it, got a play agent. And then a couple of weeks later, I'm in McLean Hospital there at the secretary's desk. And the woman says, oh, so-and-so's on the phone. And I said, well, I didn't even remember her name. She said, you sent her something. So I said, okay. And I get on, and this is the feedback, you know, first feedback from the world for this, what would become this novel. And she said, I don't know if you're a madman or a genius, but I really like what you sent me. And I actually had the presence of mind one time in my life say, well, I can't help you there, but you should know that I'm speaking to you from within a big mental institution. There are a lot of stories about the House of God, but in the interest of time, I won't go through too many of them. A couple are priceless. So I'll tell you, So I then got a really tough editor. I started 7 revisions. And then it was about to come out a couple months later, 78. And the publisher called me in. He said, I want you to come down to New York and meet the lawyer. How many people, when they hear the phrase, meet a lawyer, like it? It's not a thing. I go down there, the lawyer is there, the publisher's there, both in their collar suits. And the publisher says to me, the lawyer wants to make sure that none of the people in this novel are identifiable. Oh my God, who isn't? I didn't know you're supposed to disguise people's identities in a novel. Nobody ever told me that. So I said, okay, all right, I'll give him 1. So I said, well, the chief of medicine is identifiable. He looks like that. He's a kidney guy. He tucks his stethoscope into his crotch and he walks around seeing patients whistling. And they looked at each other. I'll never forget it. They looked at each other and they said, and I said, oh, this is bad. This is really bad. So he turns back to me, the publisher, and he says, does he have a big red birthmark on his face? And I said, no, he doesn't. He says, now he has. And you read your House of God. Dr. Epstein has this big birthmark. And, here in court, Dr. Epstein, you're suing for libel, but we noticed that you do not have a big birthmark. It's a non-libel birthmark. So I never got sued by anybody. The laws are First Amendment is pretty protective of novels. So that, it came out. People hated me. People did nasty things to me. People spread bad rumors, really bad rumors about me, which I really resented. The only thing I really resented was that they said I didn't take good care of my patients at the Beth Israel, which was not true because we couldn't have gotten away with what we did if we didn't make many mistakes at all. It was the top-rated hospital in the United States in medicine training that year, so we were pretty good. So I sort of went on with my life, and for a couple of years, I didn't go out speaking about it. People found it hard to get me, and I didn't think writers were supposed to promote their work. I was very idealistic at that time. And one day I got a letter from my publisher. It's a thing with a stamp on it. Some of you remember that. And it said, opened it up, it said, I'm on call at a VA hospital, Veterans Hospital in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and if it weren't for your book, I'd kill myself. So I thought, maybe I've got something to say. So I started speaking, and I've always spoken about the same thing when I'm speaking about them. It's gotten more wise, but I always spoke about isolation. That was the thing. And so I got to think it was safe to say that I was the author of it, but I'll tell you one incident that was really wonderful about that. Our daughter was having, not that many years ago, class was having a potluck supper at some parent's house. And I'm wandering around trying to look for someone to talk to, and I see these 2 women are talking, and they're doctors. Oh, that's good. So I get a little closer. Doctors at the Beth Israel Hospital, my alma mater, the model for the House of God. So I pull up a chair and I went for a break, and I said, well, I may not be the most favorite doctor in the Beth Israel Hospital. And one of them looks at me and she says, Venom. She says, well, you can't be as bad as that guy that wrote that book. And it was this delicious moment, And I said, well, I am the guy that wrote it. And she blushed beet red. That was the last play date I wrote. But it's gotten kosher. I mean, I tell you, I talked to my wife, Janet Surrey, who's my partner in 3 things that we wrote now. And I said, what a wonderful time I'm having here, and I feel like they're talking to somebody who's already dead or something, some of this. And the last question I had up in, some of you were in Brisbane, the last question I had at an event Saturday night at Brisbane, some guy got up and he said, well, is there anyone else that can take on your legacy now? I'm dead. I don't think I'm dying. Somebody the other night said, well, you have probably 9 to 16 years left. Frankly, I feel more creative than ever and more productive. I am more productive than ever. I've got a couple of new novels and other things. So let me just trying to think. Let me talk just a little more about the House of God itself. One of the things about writing a novel is that you can do in a novel what you can't do in real life, in fiction. That's one of the reasons I like it. And the first thing I would read, if I can find it, but I can just remember it. Oh, here. This really happened. It's an example of what really happened, which is stranger than what I invented. This is the runt early on in the House of God. The runt was having a hard time. As he sat down to lunch, he took out a pill box, put a pill on a hamburger, and munched it down. When I asked what it was, he said, Valium, vitamin V. I've never been so nervous in my life. Does the Valium help? Makes me feel kind of sleepy, but I feel pretty unflappable. I'm writing orders for it for all my patients. What? You're putting all of them on Valium too? Why not? He said. They're all very nervous. I mean, me, as the doctor. After the others had left, the runt said he had a confession to make. And I have to preface this. Well, no, I'll say it first. It's about my third admission last night. In the middle of all this trouble with the yellow man, this guy comes into emergency, and I couldn't handle it. I gave him $5 if he'd go home. He took it and left. What I was going to say is the yellow man. You know, one thing I've learned in my life, live long enough, you really learn things about what really happened, or who people really are. So I'm sitting signing books in Brisbane, and somebody comes up to me and he says, I know the doctor for the yellow man, the Australian. He's called the Australian in the book. I don't know if you remember. And this was a true story where the yellow man had fulminant necrotic, cirrhosis or whatever it was. He wasn't going to live. It was very clear. But the Australian came in, and he had a theory that if you just replaced all the blood and put in new blood, you could save him. Neglecting, I always thought, and we always thought that, well, doesn't that still have to pass through the liver? And so that leads to the runt sticking himself with a needle and, worried that he's going to catch it and all that stuff. It was a real patient and a real doctor. He said, I know the guy who was the doctor for the yellow man, the Australian, and he wants a copy of it. I mean, even the House of God finally asked me back to talk. Not that many years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. So there I am back in the same auditorium, this sort of third world auditorium. It's crumbling. And I get up there and I say, man, I never slept as well as in this room. You've all been on call. The lights go out and you go bonk. You go sleep right into REM sleep. The second thing I said, I looked around before I said this, and I realized it was pretty safe. And I said, this just goes to show, live long enough, the people who hate you either die or retire. So I become kosher, and either way, I don't really run on fear, unless in severe cases, but I don't really run on fear. I run on guilt. That's a whole other story. I'm Jewish on my parents' side. But I thought everybody was going to love this book, and I felt, what I felt? I had that wonderful feeling. I didn't worry about critics. I didn't worry about response. I knew I told the truth with a certain art and sex. And so nobody could touch me on what I'd written. I always felt that. It's like what Dylan wrote there. Okay. Was I going to say something else? But I can't remember. So there's another thing I'd like to read from the House of God that's different. And this is where, this is when I need Kate. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Yeah. As I said, the great thing about, one of the great things about fiction is if you're really a little ashamed of what you did or didn't do, you can correct it. And it's about this story. It's now 37 years later since I wrote this, and maybe 40 since I didn't do it. And I still feel guilty. And I still feel, this is not a good thing, but I learned from it. So the true part of this is later in the year, I had a patient who was a 40-year-old woman with metastatic breast cancer. And the surgeons had put her up on the medical service to, to get her tuned up for an exploratory lab to see if they could do anything. They took her down to the OR. Nothing could be done. So they came back. She was conscious, waiting. That evening, I was on call for somebody to tell her what they found. Okay? So I remember the nurse came up and said, somebody's got to tell her. You've got to tell her what they found. And so we'll get the surgeons. She said, the surgeons won't come up. And they said, we'll get a private doctor, because it was a private patient. So he's at home. He's not going to, he's scared too. And I said, look, I'm off the case. I said, I don't know who should do this, but not me. No one had ever told us about how to present bad news to a dying patient. We were, once again, isolation, right? The risk of isolation and the healing power of good connection. This is an example, actually, of both. So that's as far as it went, and in truth, and I don't know what I did after that, but I didn't tell it. In the book, I had a chance to redo that, right? So this is what I wrote. In the book, the fat man, who's the hero of the House of God, of course, offers to do it. And this is what Roy, the narrator, describes. I watched him enter a room and sit on the bed. The woman was 40. Thin and pale, she blended with the sheets. I pictured her spine x-rays, riddled with cancer, a honeycomb of bone. If she moved too suddenly, she might crack a vertebra, sever her spinal cord, paralyze herself. Her neck brace made her look more stoic than she was. In the midst of her waxy face, her eyes seemed immense. From the corridor, I watched her ask Fats her question and then search him for his answer. When he spoke, her eyes pooled with tears. I saw the fat man's hand reach out and motherly envelop hers. I couldn't watch. Despairing, I went to bed. And then later at night, Roy comes back, an hour later or something. Fats was still there, playing cards, chatting. As I passed, something surprising happened in the game. A shout bubbled up, and both the players burst out laughing. And so that was a big moment for me to redo it, and to do it in a way that came out well. And the whole book is in that, right? I mean, what's the lesson? What are the lessons of the House of God? They're all in that, in terms of people shying away from connection when they're needed to be in connection and help. And then someone who has the character and kindness to step in. And that can be a manual. I sometimes use it when I talk to medical students and interns. How do you deliver bad news, right? It's all there. That's what I wanted to do. You go in, you sit at eye level, you let the person ask their question, you give them a straight answer while looking them in the eye, and you don't run out of the room. You make the time so that you just stay there and whatever is needed. Now, people say, okay, there's no time for that now. There's no time, we don't have time. Well, yeah, you can't stay there for an hour, but what I thoroughly believe is good connections don't really take a lot of time. And you've seen clinicians who very quickly can make a connection with the patient, right? And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, let me move on. Well, I just say the four things that I talk about with medical students, especially in terms of what I learned in the House of God, were connection comes first. I'll just list them. You can have written this someplace. Connection comes, I've written it in an article called Fiction as Resistance. It's my only published medical article. You can look it up. It's in Annals. Connection comes first. Speak up. That is, if you see somebody doing something that's unethical, speak up. Number three, and speaking up is not only essential to right the wrongs in the system. Speaking up is essential for your survival as a human being, because if you keep that secret and you keep that secret, things are going to get worse, not just in the person who's doing this stuff, but you. Speak up. Third is learn empathy. Okay, that's easy to say, hard to do. I told this to the red-hot Harvard students. You know, I used to be at Harvard for many years. Now I'm at a really great medical school. NYU Medical School is really quite remarkable. The reason it's so remarkable, both academic and in terms of humanity, it's the best I've seen in the world in terms of humanity. I mean, I haven't seen this, so I'm not taking you out of the running. Is because the top three guys of this 37,000 person institution on the East River in New York are all refugees from the House of God. They were all trained there, they were abused there, and they weren't going to do it when they got power. You know, they broke the circle of abuse. Really quite remarkable. And I've been happy to be there for 2 years. And Harvard hated me for the House of God. They called me up to say, you want to be a professor in medical humanities and literature? I said, what do you want me to teach? We want you to teach the House of God, dummy. So that's what I do, among other things. So I asked the Harvard medical students in this, I said this, you got to learn empathy, and a hand went up. Like a second-year student, preclinical student, said, we already learned empathy. Harvard, right? They go through these things fast. I said, oh, good. What'd you learn? He said, it was easy. It was in patient interviewing in our first year. I said, yeah. So what you do is you repeat the last three words the patient says, and no. That ain't how you do it. As you know, I'll talk about that in a minute. And the last I've already mentioned, learn your trade in the work. And that's the good news about modern medical students, certainly in the States. They've been all over. They do have a social conscience. It's a lot that's better than what we did. I mean, I had never been out of the country until I finished college. I went to Oxford. I kind of looked at it. Okay. Let me move on because the hospital has had this initiative on safety and quality, and I'm not sure what the other words are, right? Here, I don't mean to, I really don't mean it to be funny. Here it is. The Safety Culture Program, okay? Quality, speaking up, we care system, and leadership, all that. Okay, so I want to address that a little bit. This is a whole other segment of my life that you're probably not too familiar with because of my dear wife and a woman who was very, in those days, if you can believe it, Janet Surrey, who's a psychologist and now a Buddhist teacher. She brought me into something that she was instrumental in. She's a revolutionary too, in a new psychology of women, basically. But it applies to men too, and I was the only man in this group of women at Wellesley College that developed this relational psychology. And what it says is very simple but profound, obvious, but some philosopher called the elusive obvious, right? The elusive obvious. Theories of psychology in the West have mostly been written by and based on a male model, which is, for instance, they are in this, they're in the self. They're theories about the self, right? And that didn't quite speak to the best qualities of women. And so what the Stone Center did is they said something quite radical but simple, obvious. They said, in their model, the measure of a person's psychological health and growth is in the quality of their connections, the quality of their relationships, okay? Not just the self. Now, one of the things when we did a whole bunch of gender dialogues with men and women, one man one day crystallized the male view of that by some men. And he said, but if I go into this relationship with her, I'll lose myself. Right? It's quite common. And then Janet, bless her, had the quick reply, yeah, but don't you find when you're in a good connection with her, you're more yourself? He says, duh, you know. Yeah. You know. That the idea here, and I'm going to talk about it in about medicine, if you are in a good relationship or a good connection, or this is the word, 2 words I want you to remember from today, the we, if you're in the we rather than the I-you, right, everybody is empowered to be more themselves, not less, right? I-you is the territory of lawyers. Any lawyers in the crowd? Okay, well, you know what, I mean, doctors and lawyers are not real friends. But lawyers are adversarial. Their lives are adversarial. And they can't really take that adversarial tone. They can't take it off when they leave the office either. At our best, we are not adversarial. We are wit. What the fat man said as the guide to how to be a good doctor, and it's in the House of God about 3 or 4 times, and it was totally unconscious for me, was you had to learn to be with patients. Be with patients, right? There's a lot of hope in the House of God. You have to learn to be with patients. And what Roy says toward the end of the book, he says, I just looked it up the other day, as a positive thing about the House of God. What these people, meaning the patients, what these people wanted was what anybody wanted. A hand in their hand, a sense that their doctor could care. Don't underestimate the power of the care. We can do so much with science and all of that, but, you know, enough said about that. Okay, so let me give you an example of this relational theory, or the we. Think of like going out for a lunch with a friend you haven't seen in a while, or a meeting here in the hospital with a group that, you know, not a professional group, maybe just some friends, whatever. Think of just some kind of meeting you're having, say lunch. If this is a connecting, if this is a good meeting, 5 good things happen. Okay? 5. So what are the 5 good things? First of all, each of you, after it's over, each of you feel greater energy or zest. Right? Each of you feels more knowledge of yourself and of the other person. Right? Each of you feels more valued and valuing the other person more. 4 is really the most important one in terms of this audience, I think. Each of you feels more empowered to act. You may have entered that lunch where you had to do something back at the hospital that's tough, and you didn't really know if you could, you didn't want to, you know, one of those things, you didn't have much energy. If this lunch is successful, and if maybe you batted it around a little bit, you will be more empowered to take action. This is a model not of self being in this one body, you know, like all these politicians and stuff, not in the one body. It's the power arises in the connecting, right? There's an arising, and in the connecting, both people feel more empowered to act. So, you know, good connection makes you a better doctor, really. And a healthier one, and this is all for health as well, because self is a real enemy when you get to about 40 or 50, if you're really very self-centered. Even Donald Trump. You know. And then the 5th one is what? It's a desire for more connection. You say, hey, let's do this again. Okay? Now, just for a second, think of the reverse of all, the opposite of all of those, right? It's energy, self-worth, self-knowledge, power, and wanting to see the person again. The negative of those is clinical depression. That's depression, right? So that's the choice. You know, that's the choice. And what we, there are a couple of other things. They're kind of laws of a new House of God, or House of God 2.0 or whatever it would be if I ever wrote it. Connection comes first. Very simple. Think about it. Either with a new patient you're interviewing or with your spouse, something like that. Connection comes first. If you're connected, you can talk about anything. You get the history, for instance. If you're not connected, you can't talk about anything. Right? It's very simple. The second thing is, okay, everybody get distracted too much by that? That's my other thing I'm going to talk the last half hour about phones and screens and stuff. No. Okay? So connection comes first. Okay? Relationship comes first. The we comes first. The second thing is, and may seem simple, but think of your relationships. It's not only what you say or do. It's what you say or do next. Nobody ever gets it right all the time, right? You're always saying stupid things, whether it's your loved one or you, the patients, or going to the doctor. So it's not just what you say or do. Forgive yourself for that. It's what you say or do next. So that the movement is from a possible connection to what are almost inevitable disconnects in the we, and then a reconnect. And then how you do that is not, there's skills that have to be learned to do that. But in every, and it's global. I mean, as I say, learn this in the world. That genius and those idiots, Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld, they had a plan. They had a plan to get rid of Saddam Hussein, right? They never thought about what to do next. Nobody thought about it. Goodbye, Middle East, right? I mean, it's really quite amazing, and it's very important for doctors. Very important to do that. Let me give you one example for the use of the we, and encourage you to try it. Surgeons, right? My friend in the front row. Okay. The old-time surgeons, I'm talking America. I don't know this culture well enough, believe me. This is all American talk, so you can translate, right? The old-time patriarchal surgeons that I grew up with, would say things like, well, I've done the test, I'm going to operate on you. Right? They said, okay, that's an IU. We've come certainly so far now as to say, well, I've done the test, and you're welcome to get a second opinion. I would suggest operating on you, but you can get a second opinion. That's fine. It's IU. Or if the surgeon, and some surgeons do this, mind you. I've heard this. It's not uncommon at all. It's a wonderful shift. What if the surgeon said, well, we've done the tests. Let's talk about what we're going to do. Now that's really interesting. We've done the test. Let us, that second mention of we, talk about what we're going to do. So I learned this in my psychiatry practice. If I use the word we, what's going to happen? We will come back to you. Well, I think we might, or we can, Now the interesting thing about that language as a writer, but as a person, language is so important. Language concretizes the fact there's a relationship here between you and the surgeon. It's sitting there then in the room. Once you use the word we, you can't, there it is. What's the main reason that surgeons get sued? You've seen the studies. If the patient says there was no relationship with him. Right? So that's an example. Try it. Let me move on to, I just want to mention one thing, which is, as you heard, Janet and I wrote a play called, I'll go back a step. If you're interested in that theory and how it applies to male-female relationships, Janet and I wrote a book called We Have to Talk, Healing Dialogues Between Women and Men. And you can find it anywhere. And it explains 3 impasses that men and women get into. I gotta tell you the first thing. These things are, here's the example. A couple is having a picnic lunch on the beach. And they're having a great time. And the woman has they're very connected. The woman has a sense of kind of wanting to be more connected. A yearning, a bit of a yearning. And women in these dialogues would say, oh yeah, it's a burning yearning. A yearning to be connected. So she turns to the man and she says, what are you feeling? Fun? And he looks at that. Yeah. You answered that. I startled, he didn't say anything, and she says, can you tell me? And then something starts to rise in his gut like an ice cube up toward his heart, and he tries to keep control, and he says, I don't know. And she said, and his eyes, one woman has gotten it, his eyes kind of glaze over a little bit, and she says, sure you can, tell me. And at this point, he just is, I'll tell you what he's feeling, but he goes blank kind of, and he says, don't spoil it. And she says, oh, I'm spoiling it. And they're off. So they move from a nice connection to a total disconnect. That's an impasse. It's called a relational impasse. Relational because it wasn't there at the beginning. It came from the movement toward him. And we call that the dread/yearning impasse between men and women. Not all men and women are going to, this is groups of men and women and men identify with this. If you go into a man's head, and I didn't realize this, I thought I was sick for having this feeling of male relational dread. That's what we call it, male relational dread. But it's normal, every man has it in Western culture as far as I know. What goes on in the guy's head is, nothing good can come of my going into this. It's just a matter of how bad it'll be before it's over. And it'll never be over. That's the kind of thing. There are two others. All right, let me move on to, I want to just mention, because there's not time, Bill W. and Dr. Bob. Bill Wilson and Bob Smith were, Bill Wilson was a stockbroker from New York. Bob Smith was a surgeon from Akron, Ohio. They were both terrible drunks. They tried everything. They were going to die. And by the slightest flicker of a butterfly's wing, they came together in 1935 in Akron, Ohio. By the way, I have really come to believe in this slightest flicker of a butterfly's wing idea, the older I get. I mean, except for it going one way or another many times in my life, and probably in many of your lives, I would not be here. I would not have written the House of God. I wouldn't have done the things that I've done. It's just, it's very, we think we're in control, but it's very, very chancy, and makes you want to have gratitude every day that you are. I mean, it's quite remarkable. So, these two guys were brought together, and Bill had tried everything, and at one point, and Bob was a terrible drunk, he was terribly hungover, he was a doctor, and when Bill came to him and said, back in New York, my doctor said that maybe this is a disease, and Bob interrupts him, and he says, a disease? With what? Signs and symptoms, a course and a progression, implying what? A treatment? So he reframes this as, let's find a treatment. And that's what the play shows. It shows the whole thing until they succeed. And what they found out were two very interesting things. Bill came to this meeting saying, the only thing that can keep a drunk sober is telling his story to another drunk. Okay? That's kind of weird, if you think about it. And that gave rise to the whole, not only the 12-step support systems, but a whole bunch of breast cancer support and all of those. And the key for that helping drunks was the same thing that I said in that meeting of the 5 good things. It's mutual connection. It's a mutual good connection. It's mutual empathy. I mean, in the 5 good things, if it's really in a romantic thing, that's that click of love, right? Any connection that's not, any good connection is mutual. If it ain't mutual, it's not such a good connection, right? And in this case, it has saved millions of lives in AA. Dr. Bob is known for saying, our service keeps us sober, which is really interesting. It's the same way of saying it, but he took it out into the world. After he got sober, he dedicated himself for free to see patients, to see alcoholics, and see if he could cure them. Never took a nickel. The other interesting thing about this, why it's so important, is that they discovered alcoholism was a disease with 3 qualities: physical, psychological, and spiritual, and had to be treated in all three arenas. Notice it's spiritual. This is the birth of the holistic movement in 1935 in Akron, Ohio. Notice it's spiritual. Neither of these guys believed in God. They didn't, because they tried it. It didn't work. They didn't believe in God. In fact, one guy comes to Ebby when named Ebby, comes to Bill when he's still drinking and says, "Damn it, you big lug, you don't have to believe in God. You just have to admit that you're not God. So that something else can take hold outside yourself." And that's the idea of the higher power. And I think it's just one of the greatest examples of how we doctors can create and cure and treat diseases. And I've been sober for 27 years. And I say that breaking anonymity because I felt in modern times it may be helpful for people, and maybe one or two of you in the audience, to realize that somebody who seems to have it all together went through not some pretty death-defying butterfly wing things. All right, let me end with. So you can get there's a really good videotape of the DVD of the off-Broadway show. You can get it. I'm going to give it to somebody who knows something about this, so that maybe you can use it in teaching at the hospital and in the medical school. Okay, let me just inform you of what's new, and then I'll end with The Spirit of the Place, the book I want to talk about. Janet and I published a book last year, which may be of interest to people. Just mentioned it. It's called The Buddha's Wife, The Path of Awakening Together. And it's really interesting. Once again, it's radical. It's meeting a lot of resistance. If our stuff doesn't meet resistance, we don't feel good. The Buddha, you probably know some of you. The Buddha left his wife and a newborn child, a boy, on the morning of the child's birth without saying goodbye to go off on his journey to enlightenment. And, he stepped out of relationship, sat under the tree, Bodhi tree, and became enlightened and enlightened the world. It's terrific. We have a practice done. But our question was, what about the wife and his baby? And what we imagine, there is a little bit of data. Luckily, there's a beginning, middle, and end. About 3 sentences. So we created a novella about how her path was her suffering, her incredible suffering, being abandoned, had attracted the other women in the palace. And so she steps into relationship and walks with them toward understanding and awakening. Those are 2 different paths, and the Buddhist path, of course, is. But this women's path has never been recognized. And the interesting thing, so the first half is the novel, the second half is a commentary on it, and it talks about how this path of awakening, or of being together to heal, right? That's what I said, connection is healing. That path is arising in the West now, in our time, with things like Alcoholics Anonymous, you can't do it alone, the hospice movement, you can't do it alone. All the different paths of what we label as accompanying others through life. And we doctors do that, the pediatricians to geriatricians. The connection is what heals. And the epigraph that Janet and I wrote up for the book is, she meets the Buddha once only after that, and she asks him a question in our Dear One, she says, what practices and teachings might have been offered had 2 or more sat under the Bodhi tree. So you can get that. And then the other book I just mentioned, we adopted our daughter, Katie, who's 25 today, when she was 4 months from an orphanage in Changsha, China. And we went back there when she was 10, and I've been working on a book about some things that happened that just crystallized the novel. So that's a novel that's out just now. And it's called At the Heart of the Universe. And it's basically you're in the heads of the Chinese birth mom and the 3 Americans, including a 10-year-old girl. So it's a labor of love. Let me talk lastly about And you know, I last month people insisted I get a social networking person who knows how to do all this stuff. I still have a flip phone because I can't do anything. If I had an iPhone, I'd never write another novel because I'd be like my wife, you know, all the time I'd do this. This is a book called The Spirit of the Place. And as I said, one of the great things about being a fiction writer is that you can't do it in life, you can do it in fiction. And this is the story of, and actually, you told me that there's an Aboriginal name for the spirit of the place, right? Maui. I'm sorry, not Aboriginal. Wenua?
Whenua.
Yeah, cool. So we're waiting for the Maori translation. So this is a story about a 40-year-old doctor who's divorced from general practice. He's gone around the world in medicine sans frontiere. He winds up in Italy, and he falls in love for the first time since this miserable divorce with a sensual, beautiful, intelligent Italian yoga teacher on Lake Como. So some things you can do in imagination. And he's happy, but his family doesn't know where he is, and he grows up in this miserable, broken down town, anti-Semitic town, and he's Jewish, where I grew up, Hudson, New York, terrible town. And finally they locate him, and he's missed his mother's funeral by a couple of weeks, and he has to go back. Goes back, and he needs money, and the terms of the will, he has to live in his mother's house continuously in the center of town, this big old Victorian house in the center of town, for a year and 13 days continuously. He can't leave. And he says no, and he thinks he'll go. But then he winds up there, and what he does is he joins the old doctor, the town doctor who's really aged, named Bill Starbuck. He joins him in his practice, which is, and this is the guy that grew him up, basically, and got him into medicine. And that was my story. I mean, I imagined what would happen. I always wanted to go back there, but I couldn't do it. Because other things happened. Let me just read you a couple things. And this may touch memories in some of you of that older generation. But so this was sort of, writing is so terrific because you can show the love that you want to show to people. And actually, the skill is when you hate people and you show some love in the novel. Tolstoy said, the measure of an artist is the love he shows his characters, which is interesting. Even the ones, I wind up writing these horrible one-sided figures like the chief of medicine at the House of God. After 7 drafts, the guy, you kind of understand the guy's pitiful and kind of likable. He's puzzled too. And you realize it's not the bad guys, it's the bad system, mostly, that people rise in. I mean, the thing I love about NYU, as opposed to Harvard, I must say, is that the Harvard system, I was in it a long time, it's elbowing others out of the way. It's a self-model, elbowing others out of the way so that certain ones can rise. And what NYU, with these guys who were abused, it's basically service. Bellevue Hospital is an 800-bed public hospital in the city of New York. They never turn a patient away. Never. You know what the biggest diagnosis is? Alcoholism. Interesting. Okay. So this is when Orville Rose is his name. And this is when he has a first meeting with Bill Starbuck in his office. Good to see you, son, Bill said, settling in behind the big cluttered desk and another yes smoking sign. His words came out in a calm, deliberate way with significant torsion of his lips, as if each word was being molded as delicately as an egg and required care to survive. His greeting blew the scent of fresh scallions at Orville. Bill's other addiction besides nicotine was fresh scallions. When in season, his rural patients kept him supplied. As a teenager embarked on a course of rank failure, when Orville refused to talk with his parents or sister about anything close to his heart, he was sent to Bill for advice. Bill never gave any advice. He just sat and smoked and told stories of the 14-point buck on the wall and the gunslinging doctor in the photo and the stirrups and what was in the safe. The summer after a desolate sophomore year, when Orville was bored half out of his mind and depressed out of the other half, Bill began to take him around with him, let him help out in the office. Orville had been, and I wanted to write what was good about doctrine, you know? Orville had been enthralled by the realness of doctrine, the intense contact with people at the crucial times of their lives that often helped them heal. Coming out of a family where nothing much ever seemed to take place, it was incredible for the boy to see that things actually happened in life, actually got done. Have I ever felt more at peace, Orville wondered, than in the dawn light alongside Bill and his black Cadillac on the drive home from delivering a baby somewhere out in a God-forsaken shack in the middle of nowhere. This man had grown him up. And then he's leaving, he thinks he's leaving town, so he says goodbye, basically, Orville. There are a lot of rumors here, Bill. A lot of rumors here, Bill said. The only person who really knows what's going on around here is me. People tell the truth in here. A fellow like me gets to lift up the lid, peek in under the edge, and see past the bullshit. And that's one of the wonderful things about being a doctor in a small town, you know, and you lose when you're hospitalists and stuff, is that, especially in a culture that gets more and more surface and more phony, and you can't believe what people say in advertising, and quick, you know. If you're any good, if you connect, you will see the truth. You will hear the truth. Then the interesting thing, which is in the book too, is that then you see these people socially and you hear the lies in social settings, and you know it isn't like that. Let me read one more short piece there from there. Yeah, okay. I believe that all good novels are love stories, as well as whatever else they are. So this is the love story. I'm a hopeless optimist, you know. I mean, I really do think that what I talked about at the beginning, which is that somebody had to tell this tale and tell what was possible, what is possible, still, is very important in modern literature. And there's a lot of stuff that, I mean, we quote serious literature, a lot of stuff that just takes a character, if anything changes in the book, it just takes a character and just tears him down. But I don't do that. I believe in things better than that because I'm a doctor. You know? That's our whole point. Okay, so he falls in love later in the year. His beeper roused him at 2 in the morning in the delivery ward, something urgent. And they had just had their first lovemaking with a woman named Miranda. The nurse had paged him for a delivery of twins. He'd been tending the couple through the pregnancy, her first. They were poor and black, a man and woman he'd known vaguely as a girl and boy. And, you know, that's the other thing about being in a community. The kids that you were kids with, you know, now are your patients. Interesting. There's something wrong, the night nurse was saying. Come quick. Wrong big time, he realized. The tap of death on a baby's shoulder. He explained that he'd have to do an emergency C-section. The couple agreed. He scrubbed in fast and did the section. 2 twin boys. One was well-formed, robust, squalling. The other was microcephalic, its head the size of a doll's, but with lips and nose and eyes crammed together and with no forehead, giving it a frog-like look. Trunk and legs normal, but for a remnant of tail. It was horrible to see, yet transfixing, like something you see in a bottle of formaldehyde in a medical museum. The nurse took the healthy baby to the father, leaving Orville to wait for the other to die. Luckily and quietly, by the time he'd gotten done with closing the groggy new mother's abdomen, it did. Orville went out to the father. He was still holding the healthy baby in that awkward way that new fathers do. The nurse had told him the other had died. What happened, the man asked in shock. The other baby lived only a few minutes. It was deformed. Can I see him, Doc? Orville hesitated. The older doctor in him, the good old Doc Starbuck, pushing paternal sense, would have patted him on the shoulder and said, no, son, better you don't. The younger doctor applauded his wish, though knowing that once seen, it would be indelible. Orville said, you can, sure. I just want you to know that you'll never forget it. Him, the man said, I want to see him. Notice he uses it, and the man brings it back to the person. Him, I want to see him. The nurse took the healthy baby, and Orville and the father went in together to see the other son. He'd been cleaned up so he looked better, less frightening. The father reached out a hand and touched the perfect shoulder, and then the squashed head. He bowed his own head and crossed himself. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, amen. He looked up at Orville. His eyes were wet, sorrowful. He said, thank you. And you, Orville said, feeling in this man the power of facing into in a world that, as a rule, turns away. I think she'll want to see him, too. Fine. The father picked up the dead baby to take him to his mother. Orville got beeped away to tend to a drug overdose from the Bliss Towers housing project and a stabbing victim from a happy household and a car crash and several Christmas specials, including a shepherd from Austerlitz sure he was picking up radio-free Europe through a metal plate he recently placed in his skull. Unusual. Later, during a break in the action, he walked out into the parking lot and searched in his pockets for the half-smoked peyote cigar and matches. The night was crisp. The little town was iced up, and the air tasted like cold quarters and seemed stretched tight as an eardrum, so it was like you could hear everything. He thought of the dead twin who would always be almost there, floating there like all the dead, and the live twin. He thought of Miranda, of her histories and their lovemaking, and he whispered out loud, this is the one that will survive. So, when you write a book, when you write a novel, you really don't know what it's about. You kind of know, but somebody tells you finally what it's about. And what a friend of mine told me after a while, she said, you know what this book's about? I said, what? And she said, well, it's like this doctor who's called home to heal the town, and the town heals him. And I hadn't really thought of it that way, but because he's the doctor for this broken down, horrible, mean-spirited for 200 years town. The spirit of the place is a mean spirit, actually. It's a lot about the history of this little American history, woven through this town. He has to change, And this book is, and toward the end of the novel, he has to make a choice. And I don't know quite how to describe this. He kind of has a thing go on in his head. It's not the unconscious, it's not a voice, it's just some kind of spirit, really. And he hears, don't spread more suffering around. Whatever you do, don't spread more suffering around. And he makes a choice. And that's what this book is about. I realized that, it's about something as simple as happiness is not an individual matter, which we learn from our lives. It's about suffering. And, everybody suffers. That's the Buddha's Noble Truth number one. I mean, there can be big suffering, there can be little sufferings, but there's suffering. That's what it is in life. Right? The issue isn't the suffering. The issue is how we walk through it. If we, in a male model, sometimes a male model, try to walk through the suffering alone and gut it out and draw a line in the sand and stand tall and all that stuff, we're going to suffer more and we're going to spread more suffering around. I think everybody in this room knows that. If, on the other hand, we walk through the crucible of suffering with others, especially with caring others, and guess what? That's us. That's what we basically went into this job for. That's our job, to be with people at these remarkable points in their life without suffering, pain and suffering, right? So if we can walk through suffering with caring others, not just with our patients, but we walk through it with our caring others when it hits us, we will not spread we will not suffer as much, we will not spread so much suffering around, and we'll come out of it guaranteed with more understanding, awareness, and maybe even redemption. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got time for a couple of very quick questions if anybody has some. Otherwise, we do have an opportunity if anyone's keen for a book signing, we'll do that briefly afterwards as well. Were there any questions?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. With a lot of the things you talk about, I think a lot of enlightened clinicians would know in the importance of the connection, which can't be measured in high statistics or length of stays or other so-called KPIs. If an alien were to come down to Earth and divide medical administrators and other managers into two types of people, they might form into people who still look after the patients and those who don't. There's increasing pressure on junior staff and medical staff to do all sorts of things which could really go against what you're talking about, which is making that connection.
Right.
And not only for the patient, but also for this relationship between the doctor and the patient. Burnout can often occur when there is this dehumanising, when patients stop becoming patients, where they become blood, guts and flesh and are reduced to those kind of non-humanistic sort of proportions. There's a lot of pressure on the system now to do this, and a lot of young doctors and other doctors are feeling the pressure. How do we re-engage with the people who are managing hospitals and institutions to become a bit more attuned to some of these other aspects which you've highlighted in your talk?
That's, everybody hear that? That's the key question, of course. Well, I mean, I think this, I went out last night with administrators. I mean, they're practicing doctors, but they're in this program. And there are things that I think are really very, being able to speak up, especially, the system for being able to speak up is good. I think the basic thing that has to change, and I think is changing somewhat, although it's worse in the United States, it's much worse in the United States. In fact, it's much, much worse in the United States. Even though you have a hierarchical system where where status is not equal, you can get to mutual at any level if you're skillful as an administrator. I mean, it's possible, especially if you do some of the things that I have suggested. But that's the trick. That's the trick. How do you get to mutual in a power open system? And frankly, well, how does that happen? How do you do that? I think you have to be explicit in terms of changing the culture, which we're trying to do at NYU, to the we, to the connection, to the relationship. If people start to use that language, behavior often follows. Most consultants do not do this. They do not. Most consultants that I've seen, that come in with leadership and all of that, most of the consultants, this is a countercultural idea. What is the cultural idea is the self. And we're going against that. But I think if it's explained, and if I think people realize how isolated they get as administrators, it might help. But the other piece of it, frankly, is what I've said for forever, which is, if things are unjust, the lower downs have to get together, not alone, they have to get together and try to take action to correct things. That's, I've given this talk forever. We still don't have a national health system in the United States, except Medicare, which is terrific. But, one of the things I say as an example, I gave the Harvard Medical School commencement speech, and the whole board of overseers, all 20 of them were in back of me, thousands of people under this tent. And I got to this point in my speech where I was talking about a national health system, that we needed to do this. And I said, well, should I go for it or not? And then I said, that line from Dylan, I was too stubborn. My wife and daughter were sitting there in the front row. And I say, has anybody, I gave the Shem, solution, which is, tort reform and forgiving student debt, retroactive from today, a big cheer, in return for a 2-year service someplace in the United States. But I said, has anybody ever heard a shout go up in a crowded theater when somebody falls down? Is there an insurance executive in the house? And, I said, you got it. This thing very rarely happens in the United States. You got to get together and take action for what you need in these systems, whatever it be. And when I said that stuff, and I said, actually, if all else fails, and I was thinking of Obamacare, so now we're ready again to try it because it's failing. Because the insurance industry is not regulated. You can't have an unregulated insurance industry. Nobody in the world has an unregulated health insurance industry that succeeds. It can't happen. So, but if if all else fails, the doctors have to threaten to go on strike. Okay? And the interesting thing about this is, and that hasn't happened, but the interesting thing that happens, nurses in the United States have gone out on strike, have threatened to go out on strike. And recently, at the Peter Ben Brigham Hospital, the nurses got together, they have a union, got together, and they threatened strike. And it wasn't going to get settled, wasn't going to get settled, wasn't going to get settled. Finally, the mayor came in of Boston, and they settled last minute. The Peter Ben Brigham spent $24 million to prepare for that strike. So, I mean, anyway, I'm not giving a terribly good answer because it's hard, but I think you work on every level. You work on getting administrators who are kind and who haven't forgotten what it's like, hopefully doctors, not people who come through business school. And you work it from the people who are most affected, which are usually the house state. And you use a different language. You have to use a different language. Does that help at all? Maybe. Yeah.
Thanks very much. If you were to come back as a 2016 intern in a similar American hospital as the Bethesda, and write the House of God again, what do you think the key differences would be now?
The
key differences
now
to your experience 40 years ago.
I'm so glad you asked it. Can you hear me if I go away from that mic?
Do you want to come? You go.
I don't like to be behind that. Okay. Is this working? Yeah? Okay. I'm so glad you asked that. Don't tap me the right House of God. But no, it's very, very much on my mind, put it that way. Because, I was out of clinical medicine for a long time because I gave up my psychiatry practice. I'm in recovery from being a psychiatrist, too. I gave up my psychiatry practice as soon as I could afford it. I never really, being a doctor was number 2 on my list. Being a writer was number 1 on my list. But in 1969, I had a very easy choice, which was Vietnam or Harvard Med. And so I went to medical school to get have a job. For the last 2 years, I've been back in the big system, the NYU medical school system. And as I said, it's terrific. It's the best I've ever seen. But I've seen 2 things that really, 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 really are, hey, wait a second moments for me, which is always a bad sign, because that means I'll probably write about them. And get in more trouble again. I'm too old. I don't know. What can anybody do? And the 2 things that really get me are very simple: money and screens, computer screens, or iPhone, or any screen, screens, which are the same thing. They're the same thing. And I thought of kind of 2 new laws, if I ever did write this, just the other day. This has been a wonderful trip for me to experience this system. One law is, one of the laws that really, really is a great law, but I didn't realize what it was, is 13, the delivery of medical care is to do as much nothing as possible. And that's more profound than I thought, because you do it, but what's possible? But the other 2 I thought of to address what I just said are, remember, money kills care, and screens make money. And I don't know too much about it here, but in the United States, the money issue is absolutely appalling or vulgar. And the doctors are just right down at the bottom of this, what's called the healthcare industry. And it's almost impossible. Something like 70% of American doctors do not want their children to go into medicine. They've said that. They don't want, because it's awful. It's really awful. So, with private insurance. The screen part, so, it used to be there used to be 2 parties, doctor-patient. Then there's a 3rd party, insurance, right? That was with the House of God, the Blue Cross. Now there's a 4th party. The 4th party is insurance. The 3rd party in Boston is something called Partners Health, which buys up doctors' practices and which runs hospitals. It's an intermediary between the insurance megaliths and the hospital. So you've got this other huge megalith which just spent, this gets to the other part, just spent $1.6 billion to implement EPIC in all of its hospitals. And EPIC is the most hated thing in the United States.
Tell us that.
It really is. I mean, even more hated than Trump by him. It's hated by doctors. If you want to get a doctor to hit the ceiling, even this ceiling, you mention EPIC and they hit the ceiling. I mean, I don't do it because I'm not in it, but they hate it. They hate it. It's a monopoly. It was started by a woman who knew nothing about any of this stuff. Screens, okay? They're the same thing because the main reason to use EPIC is billing. That's the, somebody told me the other day, and I heard it at Harvard too. You have these drones up there, someplace, hidden away in their bunkers, who have an online, to the emergency room. And if there's a diagnosis that is less profitable than another diagnosis, they'll probably call down, not put it in writing, call down to the intern or resident. Can't you do that diagnosis instead of this one? But they're all for billing. Okay, so screens. When I got to NYU in the first year, they wanted me to do a grand rounds on the House of God then and now. And I knew then, of course, but I didn't know anything about now. I hadn't been on the wards for a while. And so I did a survey. I talked to a lot of interns, first-year interns. And I asked them, and what I realized is that they were spending a lot of time from the screen. So I asked them, what percentage of your shift, it's about a 15-hour shift, 16, something like that. What percentage of your shift in the hospital, what's the minimum percentage of your shift in the hospital that you're in front of the screen? Guess what they said, minimum percent. I'll tell you. 80. Minimum that anybody said. Some said 90. Now, if you think of bathroom breaks and food, and I said that at this talk. I mean, this is not, and it's not like they're happy about this. They spend most of their time trying to figure out the billing and all the redundancy and all of that. So if I were to write this new thing, I would write, those are the two main systemic things I would write about. But then, I have to write about people, how they're crying. Those are two of the essential questions, and they're absolutely related. Because who's the brilliant person who said, let's get EPIC? 5 years ago, to all the Harvard hospitals. $1.6 billion spent just teaching doctors something that they hate. I mean, we've had a little bit of contact with doctors lately. I always announce, we're going to have appendicitis last month, we're getting old, Janet and me. I always ask the doctors who want no part of another doctor when they're trying to treat somebody, I say, oh, by the way, they hear the doctor. I say, oh, by the way, did you ever read that book called The House of God? I said, oh, yeah, I love that book. It's a terrific book. I said, well, I wrote it. You get the best care. When my daughter was in there lying down with her appendicitis, two of these, I didn't know now, two of these gray-haired nurses came running in and hugged me, And the doctor is not paying attention to my daughter. He's saying, well, when the fat man came in. Anyway, so that's what I was about. That's terrific. Do we have to close this up?
Yeah,
Thank
we
you
might
very
finish
much.
there. Thank you. Please join me in thanking you.